The storm had rolled in heavy over the coastline, the kind of weather that could chew up engines and tear at metal until even the strongest frame rattled like an old skeleton. Elena Vargas wasn't afraid of storms though. She had worked machines all her life, and to her the growl of thunder was nothing compared to the steady hum of gears and oil. She had been called to the naval base that afternoon, told it was just a repair job, a routine check on a Humvee that had been giving trouble. She carried her worn leather tool bag on one shoulder, her boots heavy against the drenched asphalt as the rain came down in sheets. She thought it would be like every other job, grit, grease, a stubborn bolt or two and then home. What she didn't expect was to find a Navy SEAL leaning against the side of the vehicle, his eyes locked on her as if she were stepping into his battlefield instead of a garage. He had the kind of presence that pulled the air out of the space, tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform soaked yet still commanding respect. His name patch read Cole. "Mechanic?" he asked, his voice gravel but steady, cutting through the storm like a blade. "That's me," she said, dropping the bag onto the bench beside the Humvee and kneeling down to start the inspection. She didn't look at him much, though she could feel his eyes on her every movement. Military men often watched her like that, measuring her, maybe not trusting that a woman could handle their machines. But Elena had grown up with engines in her blood. Her father had been a grease-covered genius in a tiny town, teaching her how to hold a wrench before she could write her name. She didn't need anyone's approval. Cole didn't move from his post. He just watched, and after a while she realized he wasn't skeptical. He was different. Like he was carrying something more than a faulty Humvee. His posture was taut, every muscle ready, his hand brushing against the strap of the rifle slung over his chest. Elena tightened a bolt, checked the wiring and glanced up, rain dripping off her hair into her face. "You planning on staring holes in me or you gonna tell me what this thing's been doing?" she asked, her tone sharp but not unkind. His mouth curved, just slightly, the ghost of a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It stalls at low speeds. Loses power like it wants to give up." "Sounds familiar," she muttered, turning back to her work. "But I'll get her running again." For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the clink of her tools and the drumming of rain on the metal roof. But then there was a sound, faint and distant, not thunder this time, something sharper like a pop. Elena froze. She knew that sound. She'd grown up in a border town where gunfire was no stranger to her ears. Her gaze darted to Cole and she saw it. The shift in his body, the way he straightened, eyes narrowing, hand gripping his rifle with certainty. "Inside," he ordered, his voice suddenly colder, commanding. Before she could ask questions, a second crack split the air, and the wall behind them spit dust and fragments of cement. Elena ducked instinctively, her heart hammering. This wasn't supposed to happen here, not on base, not on a routine job. But Cole was already moving, positioning himself between her and the open hangar doors, rifle raised. She saw the calm in his movements, the practiced way he scanned the perimeter, as if his body had done this 1,000 times. "Stay low," he said, eyes never leaving the outside. Elena pressed her back against the Humvee's tire, adrenaline spiking in her veins. She wasn't a soldier. She fixed machines, kept them alive so men like him could fight their wars. But in that moment, the line between her world and his blurred, collapsing under the weight of bullets and storm. The crackle of a radio buzzed on his shoulder and Cole tapped it once. "Base, this is SEAL 1. We've got incoming fire, northwest perimeter. Repeat, we are under attack." His tone never wavered, no panic, no hesitation. It was the voice of someone who had danced with death before and somehow learned to lead it instead of follow. Elena's breath came fast, every sense screaming. The storm howled louder, the smell of wet concrete mixing with the acrid tang of gunpowder. Cole shifted his weight, then crouched near her, his eyes finally meeting hers for more than a second. In them she saw something she hadn't expected, not just steel but trust. He held out his rifle, the weight of it extended toward her. "Can you handle this?" he asked. Her heart nearly stopped. A Navy SEAL, one of the most elite warriors in the world, was offering her his weapon as if she were part of his team. Her hands trembled, not because of fear of the weapon but because of what it meant. She had never been handed trust like that before, not from a man like him. "I've shot before," she admitted, her voice shaking, memories of hunting trips with her father flashing in her mind. Old rifles, steady hands, a lesson in survival. "That's enough," Cole said. He pressed the weapon into her hands, firm and certain. "Keep it steady. I'll cover you." The weight of the rifle settled against her palms, heavier than she remembered guns feeling. It wasn't just steel and polymer, it was responsibility, it was survival. Elena swallowed hard, her mechanic's hands now wrapped around something built not to fix, but to destroy. She braced herself, forcing her breathing to slow, mimicking the calm she saw in him. The next few minutes blurred into chaos. Shadows moved beyond the hangar doors, figures in the storm, flashes of muzzle fire slicing through rain. Cole moved like water, fluid and precise, firing short bursts that echoed like thunder. Elena crouched, the rifle snug against her shoulder, her eyes wide as she tracked the shapes. When one came too close, instinct and training long buried surged through her. She squeezed the trigger, and the recoil jolted her back, a deafening crack tearing the air. The figure collapsed. Her chest heaved, shock flooding her veins. She had just pulled the trigger in defense of her own life, in defense of his. Cole glanced back once, just a flicker, and gave her a nod, small, almost imperceptible, but enough to anchor her in the storm. The firefight dragged on, though it felt like hours compressed into heartbeats. By the time backup poured into the hangar, armed Marines securing the perimeter, Elena's arms were shaking, her hands numb from the rifle's weight. She let it fall against her lap, staring down at the weapon that still smoked faintly, rain hissing as it hit the barrel. Cole stepped in front of her, lowering himself so their eyes met on level ground. His voice was quiet, almost gentle now. "You did good." Elena swallowed, her throat tight. She had grease under her nails, not blood. She was supposed to fix broken bolts, not fight battles. Yet here she was, heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and something else. Something fierce, something alive. And in his eyes, she saw the same storm reflected back, tempered not by doubt, but by a trust that had been forged in seconds of fire and rain. The storm outside refused to let up, pounding the base with rain so hard it felt like the sky itself was tearing open. But inside the hangar there was only the sharp echo of adrenaline lingering in every breath. Elena still had Cole's rifle in her lap, her knuckles pale from gripping it too tightly, her pulse hammering in her throat like a piston about to give way. She should have let go of it the second the Marines rushed in, but she couldn't. The weapon felt fused to her hands, a strange tether binding her to the chaos she had just walked through. Cole didn't try to take it from her, not yet. He stood there, damp uniform clinging to his broad frame, raindrops still sliding off his jaw, eyes scanning the space with a soldier's instinct. Only when the perimeter was fully secured and voices confirmed the enemy was driven back did he finally turn his full attention on her. "You're still breathing," he said, a quiet relief beneath the hard edge of his tone. Elena tried to laugh, but it came out brittle. "Barely. What the hell just happened? I thought this was a base. Aren't bases supposed to be safe?" Cole didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched down in front of her again, his presence filling her space the same way the storm filled the sky. He reached out, not for the rifle but for her trembling hands. Carefully, deliberately, he covered them with his, steadying her grip until the shaking slowed. Bases aren't always safe. Not when someone wants what's inside them. She blinked at him, rainwater dripping from her lashes, mind struggling to catch up. "So they just, what? Walk in with guns in a storm and hope to take you out?" "Not me," he said, shaking his head slightly. "Information. Gear. Whatever it is they thought they could grab while the weather made us blind. They miscalculated." He paused, his eyes narrowing with something darker. "But they knew exactly when to strike. Which means someone told them where to hit." Elena's stomach twisted. She wasn't part of this world, not really, but she knew enough to understand betrayal when she heard it. A leak. A traitor. Someone inside had opened the door for those men with rifles. She looked down at the weapon still resting in her lap. The weapon that wasn't hers and yet felt like it had chosen her in that moment. She felt the weight of it in more ways than one. Cole must have seen the spiral in her expression because his voice cut through it, low and steady. "You did more than anyone expected. You kept your head when most civilians would have frozen." "I'm not most civilians," she muttered before she could stop herself. It slipped out raw, a piece of pride she hadn't known was still buried in her. That ghost of a smile touched his mouth again, the one that never quite reached his eyes but hinted at something softer beneath the armor. "No. You're not." He finally eased the rifle out of her grip, but he didn't sling it back over his shoulder. He kept it in his hands as if reminding her the trust wasn't gone, just shifted. The Marines moved with efficiency, checking corners, reporting statuses, calling in updates, but for Elena the hangar had shrunk down to a bubble where only Cole existed. The storm, the gunfire, even the ringing in her ears, they all dulled compared to the sharp clarity of his gaze. He wasn't just another soldier. He was a man who carried wars in his eyes and still found space to steady her when her world tilted. "Come on," he said finally, standing and offering his hand. She hesitated only a second before slipping hers into his. His grip was firm, grounding, pulling her back onto her feet as if she were part of his mission now whether she wanted it or not. He guided her toward the back of the hangar, away from the chaos, to a small office tucked in the corner. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above them, casting harsh white over the cramped space. He shut the door, muting the sounds of soldiers outside, leaving only the storm and their breathing. Elena leaned against the desk, arms folded tight across her chest. She wanted to be angry, wanted to demand why she had been thrown into this fire when all she came for was a repair job. But what came out instead was quieter, more vulnerable. I shouldn't have pulled that trigger. I wasn't supposed to be part of this. Cole set the rifle against the wall and studied her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare. You were exactly where you needed to be. And you did what had to be done. Don't second-guess that. She shook her head, frustration mixing with fear. You don't understand. I fix things. I fix what's broken. I'm not, her voice cracked before she finished. I'm not someone who takes lives. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, his presence calm but unyielding. You're someone who survived. There's a difference. His words sank into her, steady and relentless, leaving no room for the guilt clawing at her. You think I haven't asked myself the same thing? You think I don't carry every shot with me? His voice dropped even lower, almost a whisper. But you either let it consume you or you learn to live with it. Tonight you chose life. Yours. Mine. That matters. Elena looked up at him, and for the first time she saw the cracks in his armor, the weight behind the steel. He wasn't untouchable. He was human, and he had chosen to trust her with the most sacred thing he had. His weapon, his survival. She drew in a shaky breath, the storm outside echoing the storm inside her chest. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't empty though. It was thick with unspoken truths, with the bond that had been forged in gunfire and rain. Elena realized then that she wasn't afraid of him, not anymore. She was afraid of what it meant, that she felt safer with him in this chaos than she had felt in her quiet, controlled life before. The radio on his shoulder crackled again, pulling him back into motion. He pressed it once. Cole. Situation contained. Perimeter secure. No casualties on our side. He glanced at her when he said it, as if including her in the count. When the call ended, he turned back to her. They'll want statements. Reports. But before that, you need to get warm, get steady. You're shaking. Only then did Elena realize her body was still trembling, not from cold but from the residue of fear. She hated that he noticed, but she couldn't deny it either. He reached into a storage locker, pulled out a dry jacket and held it out. She hesitated before sliding it over her shoulders, the fabric carrying the faint scent of him, gun oil, rain, and something sharper she couldn't name. Why did you trust me? She asked suddenly, voice barely audible over the storm's roar. You didn't know me. You had no reason to believe I wouldn't freeze or screw it up. Cole's answer was simple, his gaze unwavering. Because in the moment that mattered, you didn't hesitate. You met my eyes and you said yes. That's all I needed. Her chest tightened, her throat too thick for words. She wanted to tell him that he was wrong, that she had hesitated, that she had been terrified, but deep down she knew he was right. She had said yes. She had stepped into the storm with him. And nothing would ever erase that choice. Outside, thunder rolled again, a low growl shaking the walls, but inside the small office a different kind of storm settled between them. One built on fear, survival, and the fragile, undeniable thread of trust. The rain had slowed to a heavy drizzle by the time Elena stepped out of the office, Cole walking just a half step behind her as if his shadow had fused with hers. The hangar smelled of cordite and wet metal, the lingering ghost of the firefight clinging to the air even though the Marines had already swept the space and declared it secure. She could see the dark stains on the ground where bullets had bitten into the concrete, the shattered glass from one of the high windows glittering like sharp stars under the harsh floodlights. She tried not to look at it too closely, tried not to let her mind replay the way her finger had tightened on the trigger and sent a man sprawling into the mud. Her stomach twisted, her mind chasing itself in circles. She wasn't built for this. She wasn't supposed to be here. Cole walked steady, silent, his rifle back in place across his chest. He didn't crowd her, didn't push, but somehow she felt him anchoring her every step, like the storm inside her couldn't tear her completely apart as long as he was there. The Marines didn't question her presence when they passed. Some glanced, some nodded, but no one asked. Maybe because Cole walked with her as though she belonged, as though she wasn't just a mechanic who had stumbled into a firefight but someone who had earned a place at his side. That thought unsettled her even more than the silence. They reached the command building, a squat structure braced against the weather with thick walls and narrow windows. Inside, the air was dry but tense, filled with the low buzz of radios, clipped voices relaying reports, boots echoing against the tile floors. Cole led her down a corridor lined with maps and mission boards until they entered a briefing room. The lights hummed above the long metal table, and a senior officer with silver hair and sharp eyes looked up as they entered. "Cole," the officer said, standing. His gaze shifted to Elena, assessing, measuring the way military men always did. "This is the civilian?" "She's the mechanic who was in the hangar when it happened," Cole confirmed. His voice carried no hesitation, no apology. "She stayed alive and she helped." Elena opened her mouth to protest, to insist that she hadn't helped, not really, but the officer's eyes pinned her before she could speak. "You fired?" Her throat went dry. She glanced at Cole, then nodded once. "Yes." The officer studied her a moment longer, then gave a short, approving nod. "Then you're alive because of it. That's what matters." He turned back to Cole. "We'll need full debriefing. I want to know how they breached the perimeter, who fed them intel, and how close they got to what they wanted. We can't afford to let this base turn into a sieve." Cole's jaw tightened. "Understood." The officer dismissed them with a wave, already turning back to a cluster of reports. Cole placed a hand lightly on Elena's elbow, guiding her out of the room before the questions could bury her under their weight. Once they were back in the corridor, she pulled away, her voice low but sharp. "I didn't ask for this. I came here to fix a truck, not get grilled like I'm part of your unit." He stopped, turning to face her fully. His eyes were steady, unflinching. "You're right. You didn't ask for this. But you stepped into it anyway. You didn't run. You stood your ground. And that makes you part of it whether you like it or not." Her chest ached at his words, at the finality of them. She wanted to fight it, wanted to tell him he was wrong, but deep down she knew he wasn't. The line between his world and hers had been erased with the pull of a trigger, and no amount of denial would redraw it. They moved again, this time to a quieter wing of the building. Cole pushed open the door to a small mess hall, mostly empty except for a few soldiers grabbing late rations. He led her to a corner table and sat across from her, his rifle leaning against the wall within arm's reach. He didn't order her to eat, didn't lecture. He just sat there, his gaze unwavering, until finally she broke the silence. "You weren't surprised," she said. "When the shot started. You didn't even flinch." "I've been in worse storms," he replied simply. "That's not what I mean." She leaned forward, her voice fierce with the question burning inside her. "You acted like you expected it. Like you knew it was coming." Cole's jaw flexed. He didn't answer right away, his eyes dropping to the table. Finally he exhaled slowly. "I didn't know. But I felt it. You spend enough years out there, you learn to smell when the air's about to turn. Something about today, it wasn't right." Elena stared at him, trying to understand what it must be like to live like that, to carry the kind of instincts that never let you rest, never let you breathe without scanning the horizon. Her own life had been hard, sure, scraping by, fixing machines in towns where people barely noticed her unless something broke, but she had never carried a gun into a storm expecting death to find her. And yet, in that hangar, for one impossible stretch of minutes, she had done exactly that. "Is this how you live?" she asked softly. "Always waiting for the next storm?" His eyes lifted, locking onto hers, and for the first time she saw the exhaustion there, the weight of too many storms weathered alone. "It's the only way I know." The word struck something deep in her chest, a chord that resonated with her own quiet loneliness. She had always been on the outside, fixing everyone else's broken engines while no one noticed her own cracks. She had never thought of herself as someone who belonged to anything beyond her garage. But tonight she had belonged, to the fight, to survival, to the trust in his eyes. Before she could answer, a soldier burst into the mess hall, urgency written across his face. "Cole, they found something. You're gonna want to see this." Cole rose instantly, his chair scraping against the floor. He looked at Elena, torn between leaving her behind and dragging her with him. She surprised them both by standing too. "I'm coming." He studied her, testing her resolve, then gave a short nod. They left together, following the soldier down a narrow staircase into the operations center beneath the building. The room buzzed with tension, screens flickering with maps and surveillance feeds. At the center table, a set of recovered radios and weapons lay spread out, tagged and marked. But it was the flash drive in a plastic evidence bag that drew every eye. "They weren't just here for supplies," one of the analysts said. "They were here for this. We found it on one of the men." Encoded, but it's got base schematics, access points, and something else, something marked red. Cole took the bag, holding it up to the light. His face didn't change, but Elena felt the shift in him, the way his body coiled tighter like a spring wound too far. "What's on it?" she asked, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. He glanced at her, his eyes shadowed. "Names?" Her stomach dropped. She didn't need him to explain. Whoever had betrayed the base, whoever had opened the door for the attack, they weren't strangers anymore. They were people who wore the same uniforms, walked the same halls. And now the hunt wasn't for shadows outside the fence, it was for a traitor inside the walls. Cole set the bag down, his expression grim. This isn't over. Tonight was just the beginning. And Elena realized, with a shiver that ran deeper than the storm, that she wasn't walking away from this. Not now. Not after the rifle, not after the trust, not after the moment their lives had collided in fire and rain. The storm outside had finally broken, leaving only a restless drizzle tapping against the narrow windows of the operations center, but inside the room the tension hadn't eased. If anything, it had thickened, wound tight around every soldier and officer as they studied the evidence laid across the table. Elena stood just behind Cole, arms wrapped around herself, trying to ground her racing thoughts. Names, he'd said. Schematics. A map not of the enemy outside but of betrayal inside. She had stepped into a world she didn't understand, but the gravity of it pressed against her chest like an engine block threatening to crush her ribs. Cole didn't flinch, didn't falter. He studied the evidence bag with the same calm precision he had shown in the firefight, but she could feel the heat simmering beneath his skin, a storm not of rain but of loyalty and anger. The commanding officer leaned over the table, his silver hair catching the harsh light. "We need this decoded. If there are names in there, we'll root them out. Quietly. No panic. We can't have men second-guessing each other in the field." Cole nodded once. "I want in on the decoding." The officer's eyes narrowed. "You're not an analyst." "I don't need to be," Cole said, his voice steady but sharp. "I know how they think. Whoever planted this had a plan, and I can smell it better than any algorithm." The officer studied him, then gave a reluctant nod. "Fine. But you don't do it alone." He gestured toward the analysts in the corner. "Work with them. And keep it off the main channels. The last thing we need is the leak-catching wind that we're onto them." Cole accepted the order with a short dip of his chin, then turned to leave. Elena followed without thinking, her boots echoing in step with his down the corridor. It wasn't until they were halfway back to the mess hall that he stopped and looked at her. "You don't have to follow me." Her voice came sharper than she intended, born of nerves and exhaustion. "And you don't get to decide for me. I'm here now, whether you like it or not." For the first time since she'd met him, surprise flickered across his features. Not irritation, not dismissal, just surprise. And maybe buried deep, respect. He said nothing for a long moment, then simply started walking again. She followed. They ended up in a secure room on the second floor, smaller than the operations center, filled with the hum of servers and the glow of screens. A young analyst sat at the console, already working on the flash drive, lines of code cascading across the display. Cole leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes never leaving the screen. Elena stood close enough to hear the low whir of the cooling fans, her mind buzzing louder than any machine. It felt surreal being here, watching classified secrets unravel while she still had grease under her fingernails. She should have been in her garage, fighting a rusted bolt or an engine that wouldn't start. Instead, she was here with a SEAL who had trusted her with his rifle, whose shadow seemed to fall over her even when he didn't move. "Got something?" the analyst muttered after a while. The screen shifted, a schematic of the base appearing, dotted with highlighted access points. But it was the folder labeled red that made Cole straighten instantly. "Open it," he said. The analyst clicked and a list filled the screen. Names. Dozens of them. Most marked with clearance levels, assignments, and notes. But 3 of them glowed in red. High risk. Suspected leaks. Elena's stomach dropped as she read them. She didn't recognize the names, but Cole did. She saw it in the flicker across his face. He stepped forward, scanning the screen, his jaw tight enough to crack. "Those are ours," he said quietly. "Men I've trained with. Fought with." His fists clenched at his sides. If this is real, they've been feeding intel to the other side for months. Elena's breath caught. Betrayal wasn't just a word here, it was blood and bone, men he had trusted with his life now painted as traitors. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, the kind of wound that no bullet could match. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Cole didn't look at her. "Now we hunt them. The words chilled her more than the storm ever had. She watched as he straightened, as the soldier in him clicked back into place like a weapon being chambered. But behind his eyes she saw the fracture, the pain of knowing that his war wasn't only against enemies outside the wire, but against ghosts wearing the same uniform. Hours blurred into each other as plans were drawn, surveillance pulled, quiet arrests arranged. Elena stayed on the sidelines unnoticed by most, but Cole never once asked her to leave. Every now and then, his gaze would find hers across the room, and for a heartbeat she felt tethered to him again, like the rifle had bound them in ways neither of them could undo. When the room finally cleared, when the officers and analysts moved on to the next step, Cole stayed behind. He dropped into a chair, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tight. Elena hesitated before stepping closer. "You okay?" she asked. He let out a low laugh, humorless and rough. "No. But I don't get to not be okay. Not in this line of work." He looked up at her, eyes shadowed. "You don't know what it's like, finding out the men you die for might be the ones trying to put a bullet in your back." Her throat tightened. She wanted to say something, anything, but words felt hollow against the weight in his voice. So instead she sat down across from him, close enough that their knees almost touched. She didn't reach for him, didn't try to fix what couldn't be fixed, but she stayed. For a long time neither of them spoke. The hum of the servers filled the silence, steady and constant, like a heartbeat in the walls. Elena thought about her own life, about the engines she had nursed back from the dead, the machines she had poured herself into because they were easier to mend than people. She thought about how Cole had handed her his rifle without hesitation, about the way he had steadied her hands when she shook. And she realized that maybe, in her own way, she understood more than she thought. Finally, she broke the silence. "You trusted me with your weapon. You didn't have to. But you did. Maybe that's what this is about. Choosing who you trust even when it hurts." His gaze held hers, something raw flickering there. "You think I made the right choice?" She nodded, her voice firm despite the ache in her chest. "Yeah, you did." The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile, but it didn't last. He leaned back, exhaling slowly as though the air itself carried knives. "This isn't over. Tomorrow we move on them. Quiet. Precise. And I can't promise it won't get ugly." Elena swallowed hard. "And what about me?" Cole studied her for a long moment, his eyes searching her face. "You shouldn't even be here. But you are. And after tonight, you're part of this whether I like it or not." He paused, voice dropping lower. "So you stay close. You don't wander. You trust me. And I'll keep you breathing." Her heart pounded, not just from fear but from the weight of his words, the promise wrapped inside them. She should have walked away, should have told him she wanted nothing to do with this. But instead she nodded, because deep down she knew the truth, she wasn't walking away from Cole. Not after the storm. Not after the rifle. Not after the trust that had changed everything. The following morning came draped in a curtain of mist that clung to the coastline like a secret refusing to be told, and Sarah awoke to the faint sound of the waves breaking against the rocks below the compound. She lay there for a while, wrapped in the rough military blanket, staring at the ceiling and realizing how much had changed in such a short span of time. What was supposed to be a quick repair job had turned into something that now held the weight of trust, risk, and emotions she hadn't expected. Somewhere beyond the thin metal walls, she knew Marcus would already be awake, probably cleaning his rifle with that meticulous focus she had come to recognize in him. The memory of him handing it over to her still replayed in her mind, an image seared into her thoughts like a brand, an image that carried with it the strange warmth of pride and responsibility. She dressed quietly, pulling her hair back, trying to convince herself that today would be nothing more than routine work, yet her heart betrayed her, beating faster at the thought of seeing him again. When she stepped outside, the compound was alive in a quiet kind of way, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and salt. She spotted him near the edge of the perimeter, crouched low as he checked the line of sensors and tripwires they had set the night before. His movements were precise, each adjustment made with the kind of discipline that spoke of years of training and the unforgiving demands of his life as a SEAL. He looked up when she approached, and for a fleeting second, his eyes softened before he returned to his task. "We'll need to move some of these," he said in that low voice of his, pointing toward a cluster of rocks. "Too obvious where they are. Anyone with half a brain would spot them." She nodded and crouched beside him, her fingers brushing against the damp soil as she worked the wiring loose. Their hands moved close, sometimes grazing, and though neither of them said anything about it, the silence between them carried an undercurrent that was impossible to ignore. By midday the fog had burned away, revealing the vast stretch of blue horizon. Sarah had retreated back into the comms room, repairing one of the damaged consoles while Marcus kept watch from a nearby outpost. She could hear his voice through the open channel they had established, short updates that cut through the static every few minutes. Sector clear. No movement on the ridge. His voice was steady, and though he kept the tone professional, there was a comfort in hearing it. She worked faster, driven by the desire to restore their communication link before nightfall, knowing how dangerous it was to remain in partial silence. Sweat formed at her temples, and she wiped it away with the back of her wrist, refusing to let the fatigue slow her. The room was small, stifling even, but she pressed on, listening for the subtle shift in Marcus's tone that would tell her if something was wrong. It was during one of those brief updates that she sensed it. A pause too long, a silence that stretched until it made her chest tighten. Then his voice came back, quieter, edged with something that made her blood run cold. "We've got company," he said. She froze, the wrench slipping from her hand and clattering against the floor. "How close?" she whispered into the receiver, but he didn't answer immediately. Finally his voice returned, firm and low. "2 figures, maybe 3, moving along the ridge. Not locals. Armed." Her pulse hammered in her ears, and she forced herself to steady her breathing. She wasn't a soldier, wasn't trained for this, but the reality was undeniable. They were no longer alone. Without thinking, she reached for the rifle Marcus had entrusted to her the night before, the weight of it still unfamiliar in her hands, yet carrying with it the strange sense of security that came from knowing he believed in her. The next hour unfolded in tense silence, broken only by Marcus's calm, clipped reports as he tracked the intruder's movements. Sarah stayed near the comms, rifle propped against the wall, every muscle in her body coiled tight as she listened. "They're circling," Marcus said at one point, his tone betraying nothing of the strain he must have been under. "Testing our defenses." Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Were they pirates? Rebels? Opportunists drawn to the compound's equipment? Whoever they were, their presence meant danger, and the fragile bubble she and Marcus had built was about to be shattered. When his voice came again, it was sharp. "They're moving down toward the perimeter. Get ready." Her hands trembled as she gripped the rifle, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She wasn't sure what being ready meant, but she knew she couldn't let him face it alone. The first crack of gunfire split the air, echoing off the rocks and sending a shock through her entire body. She ducked instinctively, her heart slamming against her ribs as she clutched the rifle to her chest. Marcus's voice cut through the chaos, steady, commanding. "Stay down. Only fire if they breach the compound." She pressed her back against the wall, every nerve screaming, listening to the bursts of shots exchanged outside. The sound was raw, terrifying, and yet somewhere inside that fear was the strange calm of knowing Marcus was out there, holding the line. She wanted to rush to him, to do more, but she forced herself to obey, to wait, to be the backup he had trusted her to be. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, the air thick with smoke and the acrid scent of gunpowder. She could hear shouting in the distance, foreign voices barking commands, and the answering fury of Marcus's gunfire. When the door to the comms room rattled violently, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her hands tightened around the rifle, and for the first time she aimed it with purpose, just as Marcus had shown her. The door shuddered again and she pulled the trigger, the recoil slamming into her shoulder as the deafening crack filled the room. She didn't know if she had hit anything, didn't stop to think, only fired again when the shadow of a figure appeared against the thin metal. The noise rang in her ears and her whole body shook, but she held her ground, refusing to let the fear consume her. Then just as suddenly as it had begun, the pounding stopped. Silence fell heavy, broken only by the distant gunfire outside. She sank back against the wall, shaking, the rifle clutched tightly in her trembling hands. Finally Marcus's voice came through the receiver again, breathless but steady. "They're retreating," he said. "You okay?" She swallowed hard, her throat dry, but managed to whisper back, "I'm fine." Her voice cracked on the word, betraying the storm inside her. He didn't press, didn't ask for details, only said, "Good. Stay put. I'll be back in a minute." Those minutes dragged, filled with the ringing in her ears and the pounding of her heart, until at last the door creaked open and Marcus stepped inside. His uniform was streaked with dirt and sweat, his face grim, but his eyes went straight to her. For a moment neither spoke, the weight of what had just happened filling the air between them. Then, slowly, he crossed the room and knelt beside her, his hand brushing against the rifle still clutched in her grip. "You did good," he said softly. "You held your ground." The simple words struck something deep inside her, unraveling the tight knot of fear and relief until tears welled in her eyes. She let out a shaky breath, and for the first time she allowed herself to believe that maybe she was stronger than she thought, strong enough to stand beside him even in the face of danger. That night the compound felt different, charged with an invisible weight that neither Sarah nor Marcus could shake off, the echoes of the skirmish still humming through the walls like a phantom reminder of how close they had come to disaster. Sarah sat on the floor of the comms room long after Marcus had gone to sweep the perimeter again, her hands still faintly trembling even though she told herself she was calm now. The rifle rested beside her, silent and heavy, a symbol of the line she had crossed without meaning to. She had fired it in fear, but she had fired it nonetheless, and the knowledge clung to her like smoke in her lungs. When Marcus returned, his boots crunching softly against the gravel outside before he pushed the door open, she lifted her head and tried to read his face. His expression was hard as always, but there was something in his eyes that softened when they landed on her, something unspoken that told her he understood what she had gone through. He knelt beside her without a word, set his own rifle against the wall, and passed her a canteen of water. She drank deeply, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat, and when she handed it back, his fingers brushed hers just long enough to remind her she wasn't alone in this. The hours after were spent in silence, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but full, charged with thoughts neither dared to voice. Sarah worked quietly on reconnecting the last few circuits in the comms, her eyes heavy from fatigue but her determination unbroken. Marcus sat nearby, cleaning his weapon with that steady, practiced rhythm that seemed to calm him, every movement precise and deliberate. Occasionally their eyes met, and each time Sarah felt the same pull, that strange warmth that had been growing between them since the first day he handed her his rifle. By the time dawn broke, spilling pale light across the compound, the communications array flickered to life with a faint hum, and Sarah let out a breathless laugh, her exhaustion giving way to relief. "It's working," she whispered, and Marcus looked at her, his lips quirking into the faintest shadow of a smile. It was gone almost instantly, but she had seen it, and it sent a flutter through her chest stronger than any victory she had felt before. But relief was short-lived, because the moment Marcus tested the signal and tried to reach their allies, the line was met with nothing but static. Sarah leaned over the console, frantically checking the configurations, adjusting frequencies, trying again and again. Each time the result was the same, silence as though the rest of the world had been swallowed whole. "It's not the system," she said finally, her voice trembling with frustration. "It's them. No one's out there to respond." Marcus's jaw tightened, and he rubbed a hand over his face, staring at the flickering lights of the console. "Or they're gone dark for a reason," he muttered, his tone heavy with the kind of experience that told her this was worse than they thought. The realization hit her like a cold wave. They weren't just isolated by broken equipment, they were cut off by something larger, something beyond their control. And now, with the enemy already having found them once, it was only a matter of time before they came back. The day dragged on under the weight of that knowledge. Marcus worked tirelessly to reinforce the perimeter, adjusting the angles of the sensors and setting up fallback positions. Sarah followed him, carrying spare equipment, her body aching from lack of sleep but her mind refusing to rest. She watched the way he moved, the way his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, never still, always searching. He had the bearing of someone who lived his life expecting danger at every turn, and though it unsettled her, it also gave her a strange sense of security. At one point, while adjusting a motion sensor near the ridge, Marcus spoke quietly, almost as if to himself. "You did more than most could last night," he said, still focused on the device in his hands. She froze, unsure if she had heard him right, then managed a small smile. "I was terrified," she admitted softly. "I don't even know if I hit anything." He glanced at her then, his eyes steady, and for a moment she could almost see past the armor he carried around himself. "Fear doesn't matter. You didn't freeze. That's what counts." The words lingered long after he turned back to his work, planting themselves deep inside her chest like a fragile seed of strength. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple, the two of them settled near the edge of the compound. They shared a meal of ration packs, sitting on the ground with their backs against the wall, watching the horizon as the shadows lengthened. It was quiet, but not the suffocating kind. It was the kind that felt almost intimate, a rare pocket of peace carved out from the chaos. Sarah found herself speaking without planning to, her voice low. "Why did you trust me with your rifle?" she asked, her fingers idly tracing patterns in the dirt. Marcus was silent for a long moment, so long she thought he might not answer, but then he exhaled slowly. "Because I saw something in you," he said, his voice rough. "Not just skill with wires or machines. Something else. You don't give up. Even when you're scared, you push through. That's the kind of person I trust. His words struck her harder than she expected, and she turned to look at him, searching his face for any hint of insincerity. There was none. He meant it every syllable. And that simple truth was enough to send her heart racing, her chest tight with emotions she didn't have the courage to name. Night fell again, and with it came a tension that neither could escape. The memory of the previous night's attack hung over them like a shadow, making every sound sharper, every shift in the wind suspicious. Sarah lay on her bunk with the rifle resting beside her, sleep eluding her as she stared at the ceiling and listened to the faint movements outside where Marcus patrolled. Eventually, she couldn't bear the waiting anymore and stepped outside into the cool night air. He was there, as she knew he would be, standing at the edge of the compound with his rifle slung across his chest, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. When he noticed her, he didn't tell her to go back inside. Instead, he simply shifted his stance, making room for her to stand beside him. For a long time they said nothing, just stood together in the stillness, the silence between them no longer heavy but shared. At one point, when the wind picked up and the chill bit into her skin, Marcus shrugged off part of his gear and draped it over her shoulders without a word. The gesture was small, but it meant more to her than she could put into words. It was there, under that sky full of distant stars, that Sarah finally allowed herself to realize the truth. This was no longer just a repair job, no longer just about broken wires or faulty circuits. She had been drawn into something bigger, something that blurred the lines between duty and survival, between trust and something deeper she dared not name. Marcus had given her more than a rifle. He had given her belief, a kind of faith she had never known before. And standing beside him, with the weight of the night pressing in around them and danger lurking just beyond the darkness, she felt something unexpected bloom inside her. Not just fear. Not just determination. But hope. The fragile, stubborn kind that refused to die even when the world tried to crush it. The following morning broke with a restless energy, as though the very air knew that something was coming. Sarah rose early, her body heavy with exhaustion but her mind buzzing too much to rest. The compound felt smaller now, its walls less like protection and more like the thin shell of an egg ready to crack. She found Marcus already awake, of course, crouched near the perimeter where he was carefully adjusting one of the last tripwires they had set. His movements were precise, his expression unreadable, but when he noticed her standing there, he gave the slightest nod, a silent acknowledgement that had come to mean more than words. She walked over to him, carrying the rifle he had entrusted her with, and the weight of it across her shoulders felt strangely natural now. She didn't flinch when she held it, didn't second-guess her grip. Something inside her had shifted since that night, and though fear still lingered, it no longer controlled her. She was beginning to understand why he had trusted her, and the realization made her straighten her back, lift her chin, and stand taller beside him. They spent the morning reinforcing their defenses, but as the sun climbed higher in the sky, a different kind of urgency settled over Marcus. He moved faster, scanning the horizon with a focus that made Sarah's stomach tighten. Finally, when they paused near the rocky ridge, he spoke in that low, gravel-edged voice that never wavered even when the world was falling apart. "They'll be back," he said simply. "Last night was just a test. They know we're here, and they won't stop until they've taken what they want." Sarah swallowed hard, gripping the strap of the rifle tighter. "Then we fight," she said before she could stop herself. The words sounded foreign in her mouth, almost reckless, but Marcus didn't flinch. He studied her for a long moment, his gaze steady, then gave the smallest, almost imperceptible smile. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Then we fight." It was the first time he had spoken of them as a team, and that realization sent a strange surge of strength through her veins, as if she had finally stepped into the role fate had carved out for her. By midday the tension was unbearable, every sound in the distance setting Sarah's nerves alight. The gulls crying overhead sounded sharper, the crash of the waves more violent, the shifting of rocks under their boots like gunfire in her ears. Marcus moved like a predator on edge, his head constantly turning, his rifle never far from his grip. Sarah followed him through the compound, her own weapon clutched tightly in her hands, trying to steady her breathing. When he finally stopped and turned to her, his expression was grave. "If they breach the walls," he said, "you stay near the comms. That's the heart of this place, and if they take it, we're done. Do you understand?" She wanted to argue, to tell him she wouldn't hide while he put himself in the line of fire, but she saw the steel in his eyes and realized it wasn't a command born of doubt. It was born of strategy, of trust in her to hold the ground that mattered most. She nodded once, her throat too tight for words, and he reached out briefly, resting his hand on her shoulder. The weight of it was steady, grounding, and when he let go, she felt the ghost of it linger like a promise. The first sign of the enemy's return came in the form of dust rising on the far ridge. Sarah saw it through the binoculars Marcus handed her, her heart clenching when the shapes emerged. 5 figures this time, not 2 or 3, and all of them armed. She lowered the lenses, her pulse racing. 5, she whispered, but Marcus was already moving, already setting himself into position along the outer wall. Numbers don't matter, he said firmly. What matters is that we make them believe this place isn't worth the fight. Sarah wanted to ask how 2 people could possibly convince 5 armed intruders to retreat, but she bit back the question. She had seen what Marcus was capable of, seen the fire in his eyes and the precision in his hands. Doubt was a luxury she couldn't afford, so instead she checked the rifle again, fingers running along the cool metal, and steeled herself for what was coming. When the first shot cracked through the air, Sarah's heart lurched, but she didn't falter. She ducked low, moving toward the comms building just as Marcus had told her, but this time there was no hesitation, no trembling fear that froze her in place. She crouched near the doorway, rifle raised, eyes fixed on the shadows moving along the perimeter. Marcus's fire was swift and merciless, echoing through the compound like thunder. The intruders shouted to one another, their voices sharp and urgent, but Marcus cut them down with ruthless precision, every burst of gunfire calculated and controlled. Sarah stayed focused, remembering his instructions, but when one of the shadows broke away and sprinted toward her side of the compound, instincts took over. She lifted the rifle, aimed as steady as she could, and pulled the trigger. The recoil jolted through her shoulder, but she didn't flinch this time. The figure stumbled, fell, and lay still against the dirt. Her chest heaved, her ears rang, but her grip didn't falter. She had done it. She had defended her ground. The fight stretched into a blur of sound and motion. Marcus shouting orders through the chaos, bullets sparking against metal, Sarah firing again and again whenever the enemy drew near. She lost track of time, lost track of how many times she squeezed the trigger, how many times her heart nearly stopped when she thought Marcus had fallen. But he never did. He moved with the kind of relentless force that made it clear why men like him were called upon to fight battles others couldn't. And when the last of the intruders finally broke and fled into the horizon, the silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stood frozen, chest heaving, rifle still clutched in her hands, unable to believe it was truly over. Marcus emerged from the shadows, his uniform torn and streaked with dirt, his face set in a grim mask. For a long moment they just stared at each other, the weight of survival pressing down on them, until at last he lowered his rifle and gave a single nod. It was over. For now. Sarah felt her knees buckle, but she forced herself to stay standing, to meet his gaze without faltering. He crossed the distance between them slowly, deliberately, until he was close enough that she could see the flicker of something unguarded in his eyes. He reached out and gently took the rifle from her trembling hands, setting it aside before resting his palm against her cheek. The gesture startled her, not because it was unexpected, but because it was so uncharacteristic of the man she had come to know, the man who spoke in clipped commands and guarded silences. His hand was warm, steady, grounding her in a way nothing else could. "You did good," he said softly, echoing the words he had given her before, but this time they carried more weight, more meaning. Her throat tightened, and before she could stop herself, tears welled in her eyes and spilled down her cheeks. She wasn't crying from fear anymore. She was crying because she had survived, because they both had, because in the middle of chaos and blood and fire, he had seen her not as a burden, not as someone he had to protect, but as someone who had stood beside him. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold, they sat together on the steps of the comms building, their shoulders brushing, neither speaking for a long while. The compound was quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. It was the quiet that came after a storm, heavy with the knowledge of what they had faced and what still might come. Sarah leaned her head back against the wall, her body aching, her mind numb, but her heart strangely alive. She glanced at Marcus, watching the way the fading light caught in his eyes, and for the first time she allowed herself to think what she had been avoiding all along, that this wasn't just about survival anymore. Somewhere in the midst of fear and trust, of rifles and broken circuits, something had begun to grow between them. Something fragile, maybe even dangerous, but real. And as the night settled around them, she knew there was no turning back. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was louder than any explosion. The air smelled of gunpowder and damp earth, a battlefield turned graveyard where the echoes of violence still lingered in the soil. Kayla sat near the burned-out vehicle, her back against its twisted metal, cradling the rifle that Marcus had pressed into her hands hours earlier. It was no longer just a weapon, it was a symbol of everything they had endured together, the trust he had placed in her when the night could have gone either way. Her fingers brushed the worn grip, feeling the imprint of his use, the history etched into every scratch. Across from her, Marcus leaned against a stack of broken crates, his leg wrapped tightly in a makeshift bandage Kayla had fashioned from torn canvas and strips of cloth. He was pale, exhausted, but his eyes held that same steady fire, a quiet resilience that had carried them through the chaos. For a long time they said nothing, the silence stretching comfortably between them, not born of avoidance but of understanding, the kind of silence forged only in the crucible of shared survival. Finally Marcus broke it. "You kept us alive," he said, his voice gravelly but certain. "Don't think I don't know what that meant." Kayla shook her head, staring at the rifle. "You handed me your trust when you didn't have to. That's what kept me moving. I didn't want to let you down." He gave a small laugh, sharp but sincere. "Trust isn't something I give easily. But you proved yourself 10 times over. More than most trained men I've fought beside." His words carried weight, not empty comfort, but recognition. Kayla felt her throat tighten, emotions rising with the force of a tide she couldn't stop. She had only come here as a repair tech, just another worker called to fix broken gear, patch up systems, get them back online so the real soldiers could do their work. She had never imagined she would find herself in the heart of combat, holding the weapon of a Navy SEAL, fighting alongside him as though her life and his were bound by the same thread. She looked at him, at the dirt smeared across his skin, the fatigue in his shoulders, the scars of battles both seen and unseen, and realized she wasn't the same woman who had stepped onto this base days ago. She was someone else now, someone stronger, braver, tempered by fire. The night deepened around them, stars scattered across the sky like distant flares. They had survived, but they were still far from safety. The outpost was crippled, communication cut, backup uncertain. The weight of survival pressed down, heavy and unrelenting. Yet in that moment Kayla didn't feel fear. She felt anchored, grounded by the bond that had formed between them. Marcus shifted, wincing, but his eyes never left hers. "You know what I saw when I first handed you that rifle?" She raised her brows, curious. He continued, his voice steady despite his weariness. "I saw someone who thought she was just here to fix broken things. But what I really saw was someone who didn't know yet that she could carry the weight of more than wires and circuits. Someone who could hold the line when it mattered." His words hit her deeper than she expected. She felt heat in her chest, a mixture of pride and disbelief. "And what do you see now?" she asked softly. He didn't hesitate. "Now I see someone I'd trust with my life again." Without a second thought. Kayla swallowed hard, her eyes stinging. She wanted to look away but couldn't. It wasn't romance exactly, not yet, but it was something more profound: respect, trust, the unspoken language of two souls who had fought through the fire together. She leaned her head back against the twisted metal, the rifle still in her lap. "When I go back," she said quietly, "I don't think I can just be the person I was before. This changes things." Marcus nodded, his gaze lifting briefly to the stars. "War changes everyone. But it doesn't always have to break us. Sometimes it shows us who we really are." The quiet around them stretched again, but it was full of meaning. The sounds of the night, distant crickets, the rustle of leaves, felt sharper, more alive, as if the world itself recognized their survival. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, his breathing even, though Kayla could see the pain etched in every movement. She shifted closer, adjusting his bandage, checking the wound with careful hands. He opened his eyes again and met her gaze, and for a fleeting second, the hardness in his expression softened. "You should keep it," he said suddenly, nodding at the rifle. Kayla blinked, startled. "What?" "The rifle. It's yours now. You've earned it." She shook her head, stunned. "I couldn't. It's not, it's yours. It's part of you." Marcus gave a faint smile, tired but resolute. "And now it's part of you too. You carried it when it counted. That makes it just as much yours as mine." She looked down at the weapon, heavy and worn, her reflection faint in the dark metal. Slowly she nodded. Not as acceptance of a gift, but of a responsibility, a bond that went beyond steel and bullets. She would carry it forward, not as a soldier, not as a symbol of war, but as a reminder of what trust could mean in the darkest of hours. The horizon began to pale, a hint of dawn brushing the edges of the night. Light crept slowly, painting the ruins around them in shades of gray and gold. It was the first sunrise of a new chapter, fragile yet unyielding. Kayla tightened her grip on the rifle, her resolve settling like stone. Whatever came next she would face it. Not as the repair tech who had been caught in something bigger than herself, but as the woman who had stood beside a SEAL when everything was on the line, and been trusted to hold his world in her hands. And in that trust she had found something she never knew she was searching for, her own strength.
The end.